It's early morning in Moscow, 2008, just before 5 a.m. It's quiet, not much happening on Kasherska Highway, a street in a working-class neighbourhood on the edge of the city. But that's about to change. In a few minutes, dozens of people will emerge from the shadows, carrying candles and red carnations. Because it was here, on this spot, 9 years ago to the day, on the 13th of September 1999, that an apartment block exploded while people slept in their beds. Over 90 people killed. Newspapers at the time described the scene. How after the explosion, the only trace of the families who'd lived there were children's toys, drifting in pools of mud. This was the third of the 4 apartment bombs that killed some 300 people in just 2 weeks. And every year since, families of those who died come back. They stand here in the half-light to remember. And among them this year is an American journalist.
Let's join the dots to you getting to Moscow in 2008. Perhaps you can introduce that bit of the story for us.
Well, I had covered the first Chechen war in 95 for the New York Times Magazine.
This is journalist Scott Anderson.
After that story, I became very interested in what was happening in Chechnya and the series of apartment building bombings in which several hundred people had been killed, and it was blamed on the Chechens. And for me, there was something right away that didn't make sense. I think when you look at a story like this, what you always have to first think about is motive. And what motive did the Chechens have to do this?
As Scott sees it, the Chechens had got a peace deal at the end of the First Chechen War. Russian soldiers had left their country. So why would they stir things up again?
It just didn't make any sense to me. And finally, in 2008, watching Vladimir Putin's rise to power, I thought, I want to go back and investigate this story.
And that's how Scott finds himself on this street at dawn, here to find answers. It's now just after 5 a.m. At the site of the former apartment building, Scott can see a couple of police cars. Nothing else.
It had blown up at 5:03 a.m. So I went at that exact time, and then all of a sudden, maybe 24 people, civilians, walked up to this memorial for the bombing victims. They laid some wreaths, they lit some candles, they said some prayers, and then they left, being watched over by the police the whole time. And there was one elderly man who was kind of apart from them, very upset, very emotional. He would leave and then he would come back. And he did this maybe 3 or 4 times.
Eventually, Scott decides to follow him.
I wanted to get his personal story. And it turned out that his daughter and grandson and son-in-law had all been killed in the bombing.
Wow.
And he said, they blame this on the Chechens, but that's a lie. Everybody knows the FSB did it.
Scott tries to interview him, but the man gets upset, says he can't talk in front of the police. So Scott asks if they can talk another time.
And he said, yes, I'll talk to you. That's fine. I'll tell you what I know.
But when Scott calls a few days later,
he said, I'm sorry, I can't talk to you. It's just too dangerous for me. And he just hung up on me. So I approached several journalists, Russians, who had reported at the time. None of them wanted to talk to me.
It's not surprising. It's 2008, just 2 years since Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned in Britain after investigating the apartment bombs.
It's still so sensitive.
That's right. Again and again, people would hang up on me or say, I can't talk about it. I saw the way people receded when I started poking around about this story. And all of a sudden I felt very alone.
But then Scott hears about someone who will talk.
Finally, I was tipped off that there was one FSB investigator, former KGB, who was still following this story and had a kind of an amazing story in his own right to tell.
The man Scott ends up talking to wasn't just following the story of the apartment bombs. He was drawn directly into it, tugging at the loose threads until they entangled him. But unlike Alexander Litvinenko, this man is still alive to tell his tale. I'm Helena Merriman, and this is the History Bureau, Putin in the Apartment Bombs. Episode 5, The Investigator. A few days after the anniversary of the bombs, journalist Scott Anderson is in a cafe. He's managed to track down this former FSB investigator that he was tipped off about. He's called Mikhail Trepashkin. And all Scott knows about him is that he once worked for the Russian Internal Security Service. And he's intrigued, wants to know why this former FSB guy started investigating the apartment bombs. Scott doesn't even know what Mikhail Trepashkin looks like, but then a man walks in. And Scott knows right away, this must be him.
Short, but very powerfully built. He had this kind of unnerving half smile that I thought if you were being interrogated and this guy walked into your interrogation room, you'd want to start talking. I mean, he just had
the right look.
He had this manner about him.
Then there was the other, more obvious giveaway.
He had 2 bodyguards with him. I don't know if they were armed, but you got a sense that this was a man who was obviously in some personal danger.
They sit and talk, the 2 men trying to get a measure of each other.
And finally, towards the end of our first meeting, he brought out this folder and handed it to me. And inside was his 16-page long resume, his CV. And what was fascinating to me about it was all the stuff he had done over the years for the KGB. And he was clearly very, very proud of his KGB background. And of course, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the KGB mutated into the FSB. And Trepashkin had gone on to be in the FSB.
And do you think there was a sense of him wanting to sort of prove his credentials?
Yes, I think he wanted to make it very clear to me that he was important. He wasn't some flunky within the organization, and that he had been involved in a lot of very dicey things.
Now, before we get into Mikhail Trepashkin's story, we want to be clear about something. We've not spoken with Mikhail Trepashkin ourselves. Everything you're about to hear is drawn from Scott Anderson's interviews with him, along with other sources that corroborate parts of his account. So, in this cafe, Trepashkin starts telling Scott his story. For years, Mikhail Trepashkin had been an FSB diehard. But in 1995, Trepashkin says he was assigned a case that would change everything he thought he knew about the FSB. This was 4 years before the apartment bombs and before Putin became president. Trepashkin had been working as an FSB criminal investigator, taking down gangs across Russia. And for this new case, Trepashkin's target was a gang robbing banks across Moscow. One night, Trepashkin says, he and a team of FSB officers stage a sting operation. Waiting at a bank, they know the gang's about to hit.
And they actually caught the robbers, the gang, inside a bank.
They storm in and arrest the thieves. But when they search the bank, according to Trepashkin, they find something unexpected. Small microphones hidden all over the building. Someone's been listening in. Trepashkin and his team take the recording equipment back to FSB headquarters. Then they trace them using the serial numbers. And what they find, he says, is a shock. The recording equipment had all come from the FSB and the Ministry of Defense. In other words, Trepashkin believed that the gang robbing banks had been working with people from inside the government.
And what they discovered was that the way this gang had operated was that they had people within the FSB who were giving them eavesdropping equipment, who were letting them know where the police were. So this was a group of bank robbers, but it was also a group of FSB agents.
So what does he do about it?
So he takes it up the chain of command. He says, these guys are dirty. We've got to publicize this. We've got to put them in trial.
And he does all this because back in 1995, Mikhail Trepashkin is still a believer, thinks the FSB is a force for good. a shield against corruption and crime in Russia. And he believes that if only the right people above him know what's happening, they'll do something. But when he takes it to his superiors in the FSB,
he gets taken off the case and he gets reprimanded for it.
According to Trepashkin, the FSB ignores these allegations about its own officers, and instead, they start investigating him.
And at that point, it's quite clear to Trepashkin that the rot of the system, the corruption, goes far up the ladder in the FSB.
But then he makes a decision that will change his life.
He writes a letter to the president, Boris Yeltsin.
Oh, wow. So he thinks Yeltsin is clean and the FSB isn't.
That's right. He thinks if I can get word to the president, then we can start getting this thing cleaned up. And that was a wrong move.
Trepashkin soon realizes that President Yeltsin is tangled in his own web of corruption. The system's rotten from the top down. And by sending his letter, Trepashkin's made himself a target. So he's dismissed from the FSB. But he doesn't go quietly. He brings a lawsuit against them. And soon after, he says, he gets a warning.
That they're coming after him. So he's on notice at this point.
Trepashkin says the FSB tries to kill him. Twice. Once in an ambush on a deserted Moscow highway. Once by a rooftop sniper who misses his shot. Now, we haven't been able to corroborate this, but Trepashkin says that both times someone tips him off, and after the second attempt, he gives up the fight. He retrains as a lawyer, ready for a quieter life. Then...
Southern Russia is in turmoil tonight.
In 1999, the 4 apartments are blown up. This part of the story you know, some 300 people killed. The government blames Chechen militants, but 2 years on, no Chechens have been caught. And that strange, unexploded bomb in Ryazan still haunts people's minds. Then, in February 2002, a group of Russian parliamentarians tried to set up an official inquiry to investigate the bombs. There's a vote, and it fails. There isn't enough support. But some members of Parliament refuse to let it go. If Parliament won't investigate, they will. They set up an independent inquiry instead. A small group of politicians, journalists, lawyers, and grieving family members. But there's a problem. They're missing someone. Someone who knows the FSB from the inside. And a name comes up. Mikhail Trepashkin. And the person who suggests him?
The person who first brought Trepashkin into the apartment bombing case was a former FSB, former KGB investigator named Alexander Litvinenko.
Litvinenko. This is, of course, before he's poisoned in Britain, when the man the Kremlin would one day call one of Russia's greatest traitors is living in London, quietly running his own investigation into the apartment bombs. And Alexander Litvinenko knows Trepashkin. In fact, before Litvinenko became a whistleblower, Trepashkin says Litvinenko had been ordered to assault him. But instead, the two men became allies, bound by a shared belief that the FSB was deeply corrupt. And Alexander Litvinenko figures that if anyone can help the independent commission uncover who really blew up those apartments, it's Trepashkin. And Trepashkin, he has every reason to say no. He's had enough trouble already with the FSB. But he can't help himself. Mikhail Trepashkin agrees to join the independent commission. And just a few days after, Trepashkin says the pushback begins.
He's at home with his family. He has 2 little girls. And the police just barge into his apartment. They ransack the place. They supposedly find a file, an investigative file that he's not supposed to have in his house. They find a couple of bullets, supposedly.
And does he consider pulling out of the committee at this point?
No, he doesn't. Trepashkin's kind of a figure out of a novel. No, if anything, it's sort of, it eggs him on. And so he continues.
The raid on Trepashkin's apartment doesn't stop him, and he begins his investigation. The first challenge, getting access to the government's files on the apartment bombs, because Trepashkin knows the FSB won't just hand them over. So he comes up with a plan. Remember, after he left the FSB, Trepashkin retrained as a lawyer, and that means he can take on clients. So he takes on the daughter of a woman killed in the bombs. And because she's a victim, it gives him an opening, a legal foothold into the files he needs.
So as the lawyer for this woman, he was able to get access to the investigative files.
It's the first win. But when Trepashkin finally reads the files, it's a crushing disappointment. He's expecting forensic reports that might contain clues, but there's nothing there.
And these apartment building bombings, they were all cleared up within days. You know, after the bombing of September 11th here in New York, the World Trade Center was a crime scene for, 7-8 months. In Moscow, everything was cleared away from these bombings within days.
The Russian authorities had demolished what was left of the burnt-out apartments.
So there was no forensic evidence to find.
It's a big blow for the independent commission. How do you investigate these bombs when there's no forensic evidence to work with? And the man chairing the commission is pretty frank about what that means. It becomes almost impossible to work out who blew up those apartments. In an interview with a Russian newspaper, the chairman spells it out. There are plenty of theories about who blew up the apartments, he says, but he doesn't believe any of them. The Chechens, he can't see a motive. An FSB inside job? He can't imagine an officer carrying out something like this without written orders. And yes, the bombs and the Chechen war that followed undeniably helped pave Putin's path to the presidency. But that isn't proof. So, with no clear lead, the commissioners press on, pulling at every loose thread, following every clue. But as they're about to discover, investigating the apartment bombings can be dangerous. On April 17th, 2003, Sergei Yushchenkov, the vice chair of the Independent Commission, is coming home from work. At 6:49 p.m, he steps out of his chauffeur-driven car and walks towards his apartment. What happens next is murky. Did Yushchenkov hear someone follow him? Were they on foot? Or in a car? We'll never know. What we do know is that the vice chair of the Independent Commission investigating the bombs,
Sergei Yushchenkov, was shot to death in broad daylight in front of his apartment in Moscow.
Yushchenkov's wife finds his dead body lying in the street. And his killer? Never found.
And yet Trepashkin carries on?
Yes, Trepashkin carries on.
By this point, Trepashkin is focused on the men the FSB has blamed for the bombings. 9 suspects, all wanted by Interpol. And he's trying to figure out if the FSB have the right guys. Their main suspect is a man called Achemes Gochiyayev. He's a small-time businessman from a republic in southern Russia, near Chechnya. The FSB say he's the mastermind behind it all, that he'd rented flats in the 2 Moscow apartment buildings that were bombed, and that he'd smuggled in the explosives disguised as sacks of sugar. And they say they have a key piece of evidence that proves Gochiyayev was involved. A sketch, one that was released after the first Moscow bomb. Now, the sketch is supposedly based on the description given to police by a building manager who said he'd seen a man slipping into the basement of the apartment building just before the explosion. The sketch, the FSB say, looks just like Gochiyayev. But when Trepashkin digs into this, he finds something odd. Flicking through newspapers from the days after the first bomb, Trepashkin finds the original police sketch, the one drawn from the building manager's eyewitness account. But this sketch, Trepashkin thinks it looks nothing like Gochiyayev.
Utterly different. Utterly different.
And the way Trepashkin sees it, there's only one explanation.
That sketch gets pulled, another one's put in its place.
So they switched the...
That's right.
Somehow the two photos are switched.
And there's something else. Trepashkin thinks he recognizes the man in the original sketch. He thinks he's an FSB agent. And not just any FSB agent. Trepashkin thinks he's one of the FSB men involved in the bank robbery, the one we mentioned at the start of this episode. It's such a shocking discovery that Trepashkin wants to make sure he's got it right.
Trepashkin goes to the building superintendent of the destroyed building with that old newspaper with the first photo, first composite sketch. And the superintendent goes, yes, that's the guy. So now Trepashkin knows that the man who was identified by the one eyewitness on the scene of the bombing was a man he also knew and knew as an FSB agent.
And there's more. According to Trepashkin, the building superintendent tells him he was coerced by the FSB into changing his description of the man he saw. Now, we've seen these pictures and can see Trepashkin's point. The original police sketch looks nothing like this man the FSB says was the mastermind. But can we say for sure that it looks just like Trepashkin's old FSB colleague? Well, it's hard to say. These pictures go back to the 90s. They're black and white, pretty low tech. But then there's a final strange twist. When Trepashkin tries to track down this FSB agent, he hears that he left Russia shortly after the bombs. He went to Cyprus, and there he was killed in a hit and run. A random accident? Perhaps. But it doesn't feel that way to Trepashkin. An FSB officer, who resembles the original sketch of one of the suspected bombers, leaves Moscow right after the apartment bombings, and soon after, he ends up dead. Trepashkin writes down everything he finds, collecting all the evidence, and he shares this with the Independent Commission. But then, on July the 3rd, 2003, a member of the commission, a journalist called Yuri Trepashkin, begins feeling unwell. At first he thinks it's just a cold, then his face turns bright red like sunburn, and he starts vomiting. He's rushed to hospital where his internal organs shut down, and his skin starts to peel off. It takes 16 days for Yuri to die. When his girlfriend goes to the morgue, she can't find him at first. Then she realizes the old lady lying in the corner isn't in fact an old lady. It's Yuri. Doctors tell the family that Yuri died from an allergic reaction. And perhaps he did. But reporters at the time suspected he'd been poisoned by a radioactive substance, as Alexander Litvinenko would be 3 years later. If Yuri Trepashkin was poisoned, we can't know why. We don't know how many enemies he had. All we can say for sure is that he died while investigating the apartment bombs, just like Sergei Yushchenkov, the committee's vice chair, and like Alexander Litvinenko 3 years later.
What effect does that have on the committee and everyone else who's part of it?
After those two deaths, the committee rather falls apart. It kind of dissolves. I think most committee members can see the handwriting on the wall. But Trepashkin continues. He doesn't give up.
Why does he carry on?
He's a reformer. In this perverse way, he's the last Russian idealist. He really thinks that somehow he can redeem this system. To me, it's just unfathomable.
So here's Trepashkin, this ex-FSB investigator, holding what might be a smoking gun. The original sketch of a suspect in the apartment bombs, who he thinks is FSB. But what can Trepashkin do with it? Members of the commission investigating the bombs are dying in murky circumstances. Journalists have moved on to other stories. Then, Mikhail Trepashkin, the relentless investigator, he has an idea. In a few months, a trial will begin for 2 men accused of plotting 3 of the apartment bombs. It's a closed trial. No public, no press. But because Trepashkin is representing the daughter of one of the victims, he'll be allowed in. And that's when he plans to make his move, to reveal the original police sketch, to argue that it was swapped, and that the man in the original drawing appears to be FSB. At least, that was his plan. The FSB has always denied allegations of corruption made by Trepashkin and other former FSB officers. In the past, they've said, "We've never been in anybody's pocket, and we never will be." And the FSB has always denied any involvement in the apartment bombs. Vladimir Putin himself, who led the FSB until shortly before the bombs, has said no one in the Russian special services would be capable of such a crime against his own people. Next time on Putin and the apartment bombs.
I want to go to the trial and I want to present this evidence there. If anything happens to me, you'll know why.
It was on my first break from Russia, and I flew back immediately and saw this horrific scene.
These pictures were apparently taken by the Chechens themselves, filming what the Russians call one of the most audacious terrorist acts.
They seized the building and held hostages for 3 days.
The car park outside the theatre became a makeshift hospital and mortuary.
Putin came out and apologized. Like, Putin never apologizes for anything. But he said we couldn't save everyone. I'm sorry.
The History Bureau, Putin and the Apartment Bombs, is a BBC Studios production. Written and presented by me, Helena Merriman. The series producer is Sarah Shebier. Sound by Eloise Whitmore. And the executive editor is Annie Brown.